this is not part of the program, but this is a space that we have here that's open. We're hoping for more and more hours during the week for mothers to come, women to come and sit and have a coffee and schmooze with friends and let, while their kids play, or we have a couple of tables back there where mothers can bring their laptops and work on their good work. And it's just a little, the biggest secret on Murray Avenue. So if you ever feel like you want to just stop in and have coffee with a friend or coffee with a new friend, the lights are on, we're here. And we hope that more people will take advantage of this space. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just want to thank Miriam Zedeck for being so obliging of opening this space to us this morning. Because of our partnership with Hillel and Baruch Hashem having kids in the building all the time, sometimes during the day our space is spoken for. Today also is Torah Fair, so there's social hall is taken up. So instead we are here, and so we're very grateful for being able to have this space. I want to thank Miriam Kaminsky for really extending my reach tremendously, that when I have an idea off of the last minute, being able to know that things can get arranged and taken care of in an appropriate way allows us to do this kind of thing. And I want to thank Stefanie for being so obliging, just kind of like I reached out to her and said that we talked about this a few months ago, these kinds of things, and just being so gracious about extending her expertise and her wisdom with us this morning. Okay, so just hand these out. There's a big problem in general that I think that the Jews have, and that is what I sometimes call pediatric Judaism. That there are very often ideas that we encounter first as children, and that we never kind of graduate past a childish understanding or apprehension of that concept, right? So, for instance, davening is like a classic example of that. We start with like a very basic understanding of what davening is, one that in many ways sets us up for frustration. Right? The fact that normally when you're taught to request things, you think there's going to be follow through on those requests, and often part of the learning curve of life is realizing that it doesn't exactly work that way, and to be able to come to a place, especially because people aren't in school when they're adults. You never catch up from that place. It has to do with the way that you understand stories in Chumash. And one of those things that I think that we never really catch up on formally is the idea of kibbud avim, right? Of honoring parents. So that honoring parents, when you teach it to a child in school, I would say is often, first of all, often kind of a theoretical exercise. And often presents itself in terms of kind of like, those like bursts of energy on, Mother's Day or birthday, and whether or not it actually works itself out in real time, even as a child, is not the case. But I want to give like one simple example of that, which about the idea that what kibbud avim means for us as adults is much more complicated. So the first source that I have on the sheets is a Gemara in Kiddushin, which is really the source of kind of defining the parameters of kibbud avim. So the Gemara says that there are two mitzvahs in the Torah. What's called kibbud and mora, right? So kibbud means honor, right? Mora means hard to translate, but we'll say awe, right? Of a certain kind of treating with deference. Right, and the way that it plays itself out, and there's almost like a parallel to Shabbos here, right, is that mora are the things that you don't do, right, and there's that you withhold from because of being able to show deference to a parent. So the Gemara says, what's mora? Mora is lo omedim kamo, lo sheitim kamo. You don't sit in their place, you don't stand in their place. V'lo sosar es tevarav v'lo machrio. Right, and you don't contradict that. Right, and those are the things that are part of the concept of mora. I will add parenthetically that kibbud avim does not mean that you have to do whatever your parents tell you at any stage of life. Right? It's true. Young children, probably it's a good idea for them to do what their parents tell them. but that's not really strictly speaking kibbud av v'em. That kibbud av v'em, the way it expresses itself is machil mashka, right, providing food and drink, malbish umechaseh, right, dressing and covering them, machnis umotzi, right, bringing them in and out, right. So as a kid, right, tell a kid that you have to bring your parents food. So it's more kind of like the if you go back to like kind of the old like 1950s style sitcoms, it's like bringing your father his pipe when he walks in and from the long day at work, or something like that. They ask you, can you get me a drink in the kitchen, right? You go and you bring the drink out. As an adult, right, when you're dealing with and that's really what the Gemara means. All of that is just prep, right, for the idea that down the road that these are responsibilities that devolve on the child. And I once heard from Rabbi Yaakov Neuberger that if you think about it, these are much more expansive categories. And there's the idea of dressing and covering a parent, right? What does that actually mean? And by the way, it may not mean literally dressing them at all. But maybe we'll get back to that. But certainly the idea that they are covered, right? So today, that might mean, right, making sure that a parent is dressing in a way that is weather appropriate, right? It's really about protection from the climate, right? Are there, heat and electric bills actually being paid or not, right? And do you have to intervene in that situation, right? Machnes umotzi, right? Bringing them in and out, right, is essentially, when you translate that into adult terms, it's about mobility, right? And are you finding ways to be able to allow parents who may on their own really be limited, right, to have kind of appropriate ways of getting in and out, getting to the places that they need to go. And it's interesting, just reading facial reactions, depending on where what your life experience has been to date, right? Some of this is clearly obviously resonant to people, who've been there, know about what does it mean to have to figure out how a parent's home is set up in such a way that they can get in and out. That they're not going to be a fall risk, right? There aren't things that are going to be, that have worked for them for 50 years and now are not working anymore, right? Well, all of that comes under the heading of kibbud av v'em, and is a huge job, right? And to a large degree, and I think that this is actually a very important point, that part of kind of early education for kibbud av v'em, right? We're talking about children, teenagers, and so forth, right? Is to help to get those messages across, right? Not necessarily in a self-interested way, right? But it's to get those messages across because it gets much more complicated. And without that attitudinal piece of saying that this is a mitzvah that's on me, that's a critical value in the Torah, right? Because I'll say it's like it's a way of honoring God, that these are people who are partners into bringing you into the world, right? Like many other things, right? Developing that orientation, right, has to come years in advance of actually the execution of the hard things, right? That's kind of the first step. And we're going to come back to the idea of attitude by the end. Now, the question of practical execution of kibbud av v'em, right, is much more complicated and much trickier, right? Every situation is different, right? Every family dynamic is different, right? So it's hard to give across the board, these are the rules of how this works, right? I want to look at one test case of what I'll call a complication in the world of kibbud av v'em, right, of honoring parents, to take a look at how the poskim have dealt with that, right, as a way, not again to learn very specific models, but again, kind of to give us a sense of attitude. So to start with the Rambam, it starts number 2. It's a Rambam Hilchos Mamrim. And it's a Rambam that at first blush seems to be an invented halacha, right? And there's one that does not have a clear earlier source, right? One of the things, anybody who's was a student of the Rambam, right, knows that one of the things that has, to varying degrees, frustrated and filled the time of students for the Rambam for the last 1,000 years has been the fact that Rambam, when he wrote his Code of Jewish Law, specifically wrote it with no footnotes, right? And there's this base that you gotta trust him, right? That he knew what he was doing, right? That he had this masterful mastery, right? Of all of the earlier sources of Jewish law, right? And he's presenting it to you, and you have to kind of take him at his word, right? Which of course nobody was prepared to do, right? So the question is, where do these halachos come from? Is a huge like Jewish intellectual pastime. So this is the halacha that he presents. Mishenitrafa dato shel aviv o shel imo, right? Someone whose parent, their father, their mother, right, have lost, here they we say, lost control of their mental faculties, right? We're coming to the world. It could be a lot of different things, dementia of different sorts, mental illness, and things like that. What happens when it says it? That one should try to conduct themselves with those parents, right, in a way that's appropriate to their mental condition, right, to roll with the punches, right, until God has mercy on them. Now, that's a really interesting formulation. What is that? When you hear those, until God has mercy on them, what does that mean to you?
Until he takes them away from you?
Yeah.
Until they recover.
So that's, in other words, he leaves it kind of ambivalent, right? In other words, is it till they recover, which again, when we're talking about dementia, it's not likely to happen, right? In other words, it might be, again, the idea that it's true, right? There are situations where the merciful part comes with the person leaving the stage at the appropriate time for them to leave the stage, right? And that's certainly an open possibility in what he means. He says, however, he says, if the person cannot handle doing this, right? Because they have become so advanced, right, in whatever their circumstance is, yanichem v'yelech lo. You should leave them, right? And you should set up, right? You should charge other people with taking care of them. So the Ravid, right, who was the first great critic of the Rambam, right? The Rambam lives in Egypt. The Ravid was a contemporary who lived in Provence, right, in kind of the borderlands between France and Spain. And the Ravid wrote these. He says, "Ein zu hara nechona." He says this is not correct. Why? In hu yelech v'yanichenu, he leaves them behind. Who exactly are these people? L'mi yitzava l'shamra. Right? Who is he going to command, right, to be able to deal with them? Right? So again, it's a pretty strong objection to this, but it's a little ambiguous. What does he mean by that? Right? There's a substantive critique of what the Rambam says. What's he trying to say?
Who could be better than a close relative taking care of somebody like that?
He's saying, in other words, the idea that not just is that this is the person who is best, that the child is the person best positioned to do this, right? That's how you want to understand the Ravids. And the objection is, if he leaves, right, who...
You're delegating it to some stranger that who knows how compassionate they are, how they really can relate.
Good. Anybody else?
Well, I would also think that if you appointed someone to take over for you without giving them agency or attorney, so to speak, what's going to happen when that person is either unable or not willing to continue that position?
Right. So in other words, it could be a question of, the buck has to stop somewhere, right? And the idea that how can you give it over to these
Someone
other
who doesn't
people?
care as much, who's
Right.
ultimately not as connected to the cause.
Good. So it could be that's subjection. Yeah.
So I see two things that are interesting. One is the assumption, right, which I think is very different from the way things are now, that in this situation that the child was with the parent in very close proximity until this point. It's like assuming that they're living together or living very close by, which in today's reality is not always.
So you're 100% correct to that. In other words, that was a kind of a normal assumption.
It's also this binary of either you're there or you've left. You know what I mean? It doesn't kind of have any kind of spectrum of of like shared caregiving or being there but relinquishing some of the caregiving. It's very either you're there or you
Right,
find
it
somebody
sounds
else.
binary, right? Good. So if we're going to talk technically, right? In other words, either whether we're talking about the Rambam's approach or the Ravid's approach, right? What is the barrier, right, from the child continuing, right, with being the caregiver?
Not objective.
What?
Not
Lack of a
very
Right.
subjective.
Meaning there was like a certain emotional level
Yeah.
of investment, right? Because part of the critique that we find of the Ravid, right, in the later commentaries of the Rambam is the question of like, well, why is this other person better positioned to do it, right? So that maybe that part of that is the idea that bringing somebody else in, right, might be better in terms of, you want to say in terms of objectivity. Like
Just
what else?
less
And-
emotional intensity there, right? Like if you have a nurse taking care of your parent, they're not going to be so like emotionally. Yeah, it's not going to be as disturbing to them.
Because is that the need of the child or the need of the parent?
It's both really, because if it's your parent, it's obviously going to be painful for you every day to watch them degenerate to that degree. But then also it might affect your decision making, which kind of ties into what you were saying, is that you might want to, I don't know, make heroic acts because you're feeling emotional towards your parent, whereas someone who's more objective and maybe more professionally oriented in healthcare could make a more scientific decision.
Good. So I want to comment on that for a second. The Ravid's position seems to, and again, it could be that such people didn't exist at that point, right? That it seems to assume the child is going to be the best caregiver, right? And then maybe it's not, and there's also a question of just ability to navigate appropriately in that situation, right? That might be the issue, that's really at stake over there. So that might be, again, in other words, it could be that if you told the Ravid, well, no, we have like trained people who are, skilled nurses or whatever it is, and again, that in certain ways, medicine has changed kind of very fundamentally, as far as things like that are concerned, which, by the way, causes part of the situation, right? There's the space between, to put it bluntly, between life and death has expanded tremendously in terms of, it used to be that, you had to get through, if like strep didn't kill you or something, there are a lot of barriers, right, to make it to, 70, 80 years old. And thank God today, as long as the antibiotics hold, right, are not issues the same way. But because of that, there's a lot of like medical complexity, right? It happens to be right now we're talking more about mental health, right, or in terms of cognitive ability, as far as that's concerned. But Nina.
Two things. One is I think we should make sure to pay attention to the fact that when you said what is it that the caregiver, the child can't do, that we're not talking about any kind of physical limitation on the part of the mother or the parent and the child. This isn't that the child can't lift the parent. It's implied in what's here that we're talking about a mental anguish.
Yes.
Between both. And also I don't know if the Hebrew words match, but it would have been different if it would have said he is allowed to charge others with care without saying he has to leave. Mm-hmm. Leaving sounds like this person's absolutely leaving the city, and who knows how far they're going. It's not just they're going to their home, which is 2 blocks away.
Good. So that brings us to the question, where did the Rambam get this idea from? So basically all the commentaries in the Rambam point us to a story in Masechet Kiddushin. It's interesting, by the way, that Masechet Kiddushin is the section of the Talmud which deals fundamentally with the laws of marriage, right? And it's how marriages are contracted. The largest prolonged discussion of Kibbutz Avim happens to be in Masechet Kiddushin, right? So the Talmud, in certain ways, is, let's say, it's not organized in a Western linear kind of way, right? There was a guy who, I think 20 years ago, wrote a book called The Talmud in Hypertext, when the internet was first like, you know, a thing. And he said that basically like the way that you like jump from thing to thing when you're like clicking on things on the internet, right, is the best analogy to understanding the way that the Gemara works. Right? The Gemara takes up one topic, right, and that topic segues into another topic and into another topic, right, and it's just a totally different way of organizing ideas and information. So it's not surprising to find something off topic. There is a theory that people have that sometimes that there's more of a method to the madness, right, and that sometimes things are there's a message, right, in where things get placed in the Gemara, right, and the idea, and this is not going to be our topic today, that one of the questions in terms of caring for parents is the question of how do you balance that with other responsibilities. Very often that, again, you have the sandwich generation, which seems to, the same way that sandwiches, right, over time have gotten bigger and bigger, that the sandwich generation seems to, like, keep adding in, like, more stuff to the sandwich. That the responsibility, someone might simultaneously be dealing with an aging parent, right, and young children, or children that are, teenagers or young adults or whatever, and maybe also dealing with first grandchildren at the same time, right, and are running, right, from one thing to the other, right, the idea of trying to figure out what that balance is. One of the things that is discussed in Postgame is it's a really bad idea, right, for an older parent, right, to become an issue in a marriage, right, that's something that needs to be kind of like dealt with forthrightly and in advance, right, because that can become a very, serious issue of shalom bias. And that generally there seems to be an assumption that those are really legitimate issues and conversations that need to be had. Again, Stephanie's going to talk about conversations ahead of time. So the Gemara Kiddush tells the following story. Rav Asi he imas Kana. Rav Asi had an elderly mother. So Amrole, she said to him, Ba'ina tachshita. She said, I need jewelry, right? And he said, no problem, Avadlay. He went and made jewelry for his mother. So the next thing she says, Ba'ina Gavra. She said, I need a man, right? I want you to go find, right, sign me up for, saw you at Sinai, right? I need to have, like, a man in my life. And he says, I'll do it, right? Which, again, is in many ways a remarkable thing, right? It's not always easy for a child to be involved in the dating process of the elderly parents. And he says, I'm going to do it. I'm going to look at it. He says, Ba'ina Gavra the Shaper Kavosach. He said, I want a husband who is as handsome as you. And again, what almost sounds like a punchline, Shav Keva Azal Aretz Yisrael. So he left and went to Eretz Yisrael, right? He lived in Bavel, right? And that's where he said, okay, this is like out of control right now. And again, there are a lot of possibilities of how to read that, right? One is the idea that she's now asking for things that are completely irrational, right? And there's the idea that, his 80-year-old mother, right, is going to have some 35-year-old guy who's going to marry her, right, is, like, really delusional, right? And the idea that, like, that's not something that he can actually deal with or provide, right? Others read it as that there really is a, that there's this, like, bizarre lifting of inhibitions that's taken place, right? That there's this, role reversal going on in a way that's really inappropriate. And that's really, like, once things hit that level, right, that, like, it's not something that, like, this is crossed the line, right? And that again, the very fact that this idea that he, like, moves across the world, right, as a response to that might be like this is not working anymore. And the assumption is, right, that the Rambam took this story, right, and formulated it in a legal way and said, okay, what do we learn from this story? Bottom line is there's a point that comes, right, where it is appropriate for a child to say, right, I can't be directly involved with this parent anymore. Now, so there's an interesting technical, does that mean that once you hit that level, right, that, and again, this can play itself out in a lot of different ways, right? If the relationship just becomes one of conflict and butting heads, right? Sometimes the bigger kibbutz of the aim, right, is being able to pull back in that situation, right? Whether it means like literally moving somewhere else or not, right? But the idea that, and this perhaps sharpens the question of the other people, right? The question in the Rambam and the Ravid. The Ridvaz, right, was a 17th, 16th century Egyptian commentary on the Rambam in source 5. Basically, it says, look, practically speaking, he says dealing with a parent that is, really falling deeper into dementia, right? That the care might include physical things, right, that are not appropriate for the child to be involved in. Now, again, you have to perhaps, but the idea that if caring for a parent means physically restraining them, right, and stopping them, again, there's a little to be said here about 16th century methods of how they dealt with the mentally incapacitated. He says, "Efshal yidei hakah tasor mishtusa." Right? Sometimes maybe it would be that you'd have to, kind of slap the person around a little bit to be able to like shake them out of. I don't think this actually works, right? Unless you see it like in movies sometimes, I'm not sure this is a technique to actually probably
Snap
not
out of it.
probably not recommended, right? But the idea is like a child can't do that, right? And the idea that's actually an idea that we do encounter in halacha as well of like what are the limits, right, of kind of we'll call it an internal kibbutz av aim dilemma, right? And this actually plays itself out in the question of can a child be involved in bathing a parent, right? And what's actually an interesting question, what about administering medical treatments that are, again, a child is not allowed to hit a parent, right? That's a halach actually in the Torah itself, right? Can a child give their parent injections or not, right? And that's, again, it's a matter of some debate. Some of it has to do with the question of is there bruising that will result or not, right? But the bottom line is that the answer to the question of the Ridvaz on the Rambam of maybe somebody else can do things not just because of a question of skill, but there are things that maybe a child is not supposed to be doing for a parent, right? It's not appropriate to go in that direction, and it may actually, in its own way, kind of undermine the whole kind of kibbutz av aim structure, right? Which we'll kind of come to in the end, right? Because again, like the question of role reversal, right, when it comes to elderly parents, right, is it's very taxing, right? Again, depending on the condition of both of them, it's hard on the parent, right? This is, I think, probably one of the big, that loss of agency when getting older is very difficult, right? And the idea that the child that you took care of, right, and that you, and we all know taking care of doesn't end when they turn 18, right? There's that there are many different ways of taking care of a child, right? The idea that like you're on the opposite side of the ledger can be very, very difficult, right? So the idea is in order to properly call out, to do kibbutz av aim in that circumstance, you may have to bring somebody else into the picture, right? Again, all of it is very situational. What's interesting, the Kesef Mishnah, which is the author of the Shulchan Aruch's commentary on the Rambam, says the story about Ravasi doesn't say anything about him like putting her in a home, hiring nurses, right? We don't know. It's just kind of a black hole. He says that the Rambam must have assumed that was the case. Like he didn't just leave her hanging, waiting for her date to show up, right? It's like somebody had to like kind of step in and deal with the situation, right? But then more, it's good advice, right? In that situation, because you can't do it, right? Like best practice is to make sure that she's taken care of, right? Which may be a question of, is it possible that there's no obligation of kibbutz av aim, right? Once you get to that point, right? A good practice is to make sure somebody's taking care of them, right? But maybe even the obligation starts to attenuate at that point. So it's interesting to know, this is adopted in halacha, right? This position of the Rambam is found in Shulchan Aruch, and is one of the critical sources, right, in the question of people who find themselves at that kind of difficult place of trying to figure out what the right thing to do, falls in that place. But more to the point, I want to end with two last halachos in the Shulchan Aruch. Source number 8, which is actually drawn pretty much directly from the Gemara, quotes the idea that we started with, right? That honor for parents is feeding them, giving them stuff to drink, covering them, mobility, bringing them in and out, right? All of those are subsumed under Kibbud Av V'Em. But here's the critical one. Right? V'itnanu lo b'sever panim yafos, she'afilu mafnil b'chol yom petumos, v'hera lo panim zoafos nana shalav. He says the critical thing is to do it with a display of, let's call it, positive energy, right? That it has to be done in a way, right, where the parent feels like they're a burden, right? That they feel that this is something that the child is happy to do, right? Which is super hard, right? That there's a reason why Chazal said this is one of the most difficult mitzvahs in the Torah. And the Ramah jumps in and adds the end of, so the first part says even you can feed them delicacies if you're like, do it in a bad mood, right? Do it with a sense of this is very difficult, right? There's actually an example that is given in the Gemara where a parent asks the child, like, where did you get all this great stuff from? And the response is like, like, Grandpa, what do you care? Like, here's, just eat your food, right? In other words, that is, right, you're going through the motions, right, but that's not really Kibbud Av V'Em. The Rama says sometimes you might be doing things that are actually not in their conventionally Kibbud Av V'Em. So we could set up their father to work grinding millstones, right? But if that's something that is at that stage in their life, right, something that is kind of a better setup for them than what you would normally think of as pleasant activities, and you do it in a way, right, where medaber piyusim alev aviv, and that you work, the way that you talk to the parent is you explain why you're doing it in a way that is, kind and patient. That's real Kibbud Av V'Em, right? And there's the idea that the way that it manifests itself, right, is very wide, right? And it's that and very situationally determined, right? But the idea that number one, you have to kind of work on the attitude in advance, right, and on the relationship before it gets complicated, right? That is something that kind of like goes into this, and the idea of being able to try to manifest that kind of attitude. The last thing, which I seem to have left out the Hebrew, but that's okay, is source number 9, talks about the question of the finances, right? And there's like, in the end of the day, right, who pays for this? And this is something that in terms of, is often something that is something that the parent should be thinking about preemptively, right? Especially we live in a very different financial world than people lived in for a very long time, right? Very few people have like daily subsistence money, right? There's the idea that like, just again, the existence of credit and bank accounts and investments and things like that, right, kind of changed the landscape as far as that's concerned. So when we talk about the obligation of a child to provide for their parents, right, it's with their parents' property, right? That the first kind of line of defense, right, is whatever the parent has, that's what the child uses to provide for them. However, right, if the parent doesn't, right, the child is then responsible, right, for providing for the needs of the parent, right? And there's a debate of how far that goes, right? But the last issue, which I'll bring up here, right, is the Ramah says that when you have multiple children, right, then essentially there has to be kind of an internal assessment of what the different children are able to provide. And it says, basically it says that, this is an old Ashkenazi tradition, right, that if you have a significant income gap, right, between siblings, the one with the most money is responsible for taking care of the parent in that circumstance. And I do think you can widen that. It's not just a question of financial resources, right? There's the question of time resources, ability resources, that the idea, and this is something that, again, hopefully, kind of happens naturally, but the idea that siblings need to be able to think about both the, call it the burden sharing, right? The opportunities, there's like what they each bring to the table, as far as resources. You know, one who lives, you know, again, you'll often have a situation with like a sibling that lives closer, siblings that live farther away, right? Siblings that have, you know, different professional obligations and so forth. But the idea that like that's a certain kind of triage question, right? That needs to kind of be assessed, again, on a situation by situation basis. Yeah, Bela.
So the question though is, the way this is all described, there never seems to be this concept of just a partnership with the caretaker, who you might have to hire someone responsible to be a professional person, and then you stay involved in the picture. Like he doesn't phrase it in those terms. He phrases it as you check out and you let somebody else step in and take over.
Right,
Like,
so I
why
think
is that not the halachic formulation?
Right.
You
So I
set
think
it up
that
together
there weren't necessarily always
like a professional.
those kinds of, you know, that in certain ways is even the idea of you know, let's call it the Moshev Canaan, right? There's like the old age home, is a relatively modern development in Jewish communities. You know, that you're talking like 19th century, before such things existed, right? And the kind of the default was, and again, the idea that like multi-generational, you know, homes were things that were just kind of taken for granted, right? That's the way that, you know, and again, sometimes like a home would stay in a family, you know, for generations and generations, right? And just, you know, the residents would cycle through.
It almost sounds
Yeah.
like the reverse of like a baby, right? Like if somebody says like, oh, like somebody has a baby they can't take care of, right? Like then you put them up for adoption and somebody else steps in and takes care of them, and you wouldn't say like, you know, oh, and you would like, yes, hire a caregiver, but like that formulation of like that level of care, like meaning not a question of like, oh, a babysitter, but like a question of like, I can't do it, right? And then somebody else is doing it. So I think that's sort of it's like the same thing but flipped, where like somebody has total responsibility, and so therefore like leaving means abdicating that total responsibility, as opposed to the model that we have now where you can share that responsibility.
And again, I just follow up with that. In general, right, in a lot of different settings, shared responsibilities, right, in practice often, like in many different settings, right, means that, you know, lots of people aren't doing something, right, rather than somebody is doing something, you know, and that's the,
Like somebody has to be
the go-to person as far as dealing with that situation. So that I hope kind of outlines like some of the theory behind this. Stefanie has a tremendous amount of experience and insight into how this plays itself out in the real world. So it's very excited to be able to share the chair with her.
We're gonna swap.
So for those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Stefanie Small. I'm the clinical director at Jewish Family and Community Services, and I've been at JFCS for 22 years, and I'm just planning to stay forever. And I am a geriatric social worker by training and by trade, and this is really my passion, is caregiver. So the first thing I actually want to ask is, how many of you sitting here consider yourself a caregiver? Right? And that could be in any way, shape, or form. And guess what? If you're not now, you will. Right? Death, taxes, and caregiving. Those are the three certainties of the world. So, getting older from the older person's point of view is hard enough. Right? Things don't work as well. Things slow down. Their brains may actually work great and their bodies are not cooperating. I think we probably all feel that right now. And yet, when we look at it from the caregiver point of view, it's just as hard. You know, number one, Rabbi Yolkut said, that role reversal is one of the hardest things for children and parents to handle. Because a parent can be 90 years old, infirm, in bed, possibly on hospice, and their 60-year-old daughter is sitting there trying to help, and they're taking direction from the 90-year-old, even though a lot of that should not be directed. The 90-year-old's like, you know what, you need to bring me a glass of scotch every hour on the hour. And part of your, keep it on, it's like, okay, that's what she said. It's like, okay, but if she's not on hospice, please don't do that. If she is on hospice, do whatever she wants. If she's not, does that really, is that caring? The caregiver might be okay with it. Well, she's going to be very sleepy all day, makes my life a little easier, right? You have to find a balance. But role reversal and suddenly becoming the parent to your parent it feels out of place, it feels out of order, and it is a difficult kind of thing. Parental dignity and autonomy change when you have role reversal, right? Now you're the one in charge, and you have to make decisions with the people as long as possible. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But it's very difficult on everybody, right? I just want to be the kid, why can't they take care of me forever? Well, when they're 90 and 60, sometimes that changes. When they're 40 and 70, it doesn't even matter. That's a tough one. Getting older, unfortunately, it's unpleasant to talk about. Nobody really likes to talk about it. Americans really don't like talking about getting older. It is denial. That's why plastic surgeons are probably the best well-paid doctors in this country. Nobody likes to talk about getting older. Americans particularly, and yet it's real, right? Fear and anxiety kind of subsume everything about getting older, but decisions have to be made, and so you have to face those fears. You have to face the anxiety. It's also unpleasant because sometimes when you're having these conversations, anger comes into play, right? Your parents may not really be happy that, or your loved ones are not happy that you're trying to take a role in their lives, and they kind of yell at you, and you, do I take it, do I not? It's just unpleasant to be around that feeling. It's also denial, right? How many people do we know in our lives like, I'm fine, you don't have to take over my bills, I can see fine with my double cataracts and glaucoma. Don't worry, I can still see every number on my checkbook. Oh, okay, if you say so. I'm 46, I'm wearing reading glasses, don't tell me you can see that. But that denial, right? People ignore warning signs about their own self-function. Again, at any age, but especially as we get older, and especially if cognitive dysfunction comes into play. There's privacy issues, right? When we talk about clothing our loved ones, versus, bathing our loved ones, clothing, like literally dressing them, where is the line that we have between what we know we need to do for them and what they want us to do? Many, many years ago, my grandmother's been gone for about 8 years at this point, but years before that, she needed help in the restroom, and so she grabbed me and I went in, and she was very upset. She said, don't tell my kids. I'm like, Grandma, I'm not going to tell them anything. She goes, you're a geriatric social worker. I know you won't tell anyone. But she was so upset about the fact that she needed any kind of assistance. She goes, don't tell my kids. But meanwhile, all of her kids were like in the living room and knew that I was in there with her. But it was very important to her that I not say anything. I said, no problem. No problem. That dignity, that privacy, you want to respect it, but you also have to balance it with reality. But it's also time filled with assumptions, right? We might be going in there all gangbusters going, all right, Mom, we're changing everything. And Mom is sitting there back from her yoga class, sitting there drinking a cup of green tea going, what are we changing? I'm in better shape than you. And you have to wonder, like, well, where is the line? Like, am I assuming too much that maybe they actually are better than I know they are, but I may not be right there with them all the time, so I don't see it. It's also about mortality, right? Even before, we're discussing, death, but none of us use the word death. And we have to learn that the word, especially in our community right now, it's scary, but it is a part of life. It is, again, death, taxes, and caregiving. If we don't face it head on and know that that is the end of the road, and how do we deal with that, then we really can't have honest conversations about the different journeys we're going to take. So, especially kids, as adult children, the idea of losing our parents is very hard. We don't want to think about that, but it's reality. So what do? We have to prepare for the future while being mindful of the present and the past. So how do we do that? The first thing you want to do is as I say, the stages are all is well, things begin to get bad, and then crisis. Now you would think, well, isn't there like a middle road between begin to get bad and crisis? Yes, if you plan. If you don't plan, there's no middle road. It's just 1, 2, all right. So we always want to plan for the worst and hope for the best. And this is the whole idea behind car insurance and home insurance, right? We all pay those premiums, and we all hope we never have to collect on those premiums, right? Which is like the only thing you pay towards and hope you never collect on. But we pay it because just in case. These conversations you have are just in case. You may never need it. You may never need to put into play any of the plans you make. But if you don't have the conversations and have the plans, then you run into crisis. So knowing that, you know, you say Moshav Zakanim, only about 5%, 6% of older adults ever needed a nursing home. Personal care homes didn't exist back in the day, right? It was home or nursing home. And most people don't go into a nursing home nowadays. They might go into a personal care home, but you can also balance that with in-home care. There's different ways. So knowing that you are probably looking at, statistically, looking at in-home care, you have to figure out the ways around that, and what does it mean? There's community services in every city. Well, if you live in really rural areas, move your loved ones closer to civilization. That's the first thing I would tell you. There's really nothing out in the rural areas. Whether it's here, whether it's in New York, in New Jersey, the more rural you are, the fewer services there are that exist. Right? Cities are really the best place. Allegheny County, Pittsburgh happens to have enormous amounts of resources. Florida does too, but it has to be Florida. So, you know, moving people closer in, it makes sense. It does make sense to do so, to look for the resources. If they're already in areas where they're comfortable and there are resources available, great. Don't move them here necessarily. But if they really do live in the middle of nowhere, consider, you know, pragmatically moving them places where that is. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. Before you have these conversations with your loved ones, you need to be aware of what you can and cannot do. And this is financial resources, this is emotional resources. What can you do and what can't you do? What is need and what is want? So, especially for families in the sandwich generation, which is getting bigger and getting more full, what are we actually able to do? So we have to have a very introspective kind of self-conversation. What am I capable of? And when I mentioned before, right, future, present, past, a lot of that does have to do with what kind of daughter can I be to the parents that they were. For those of us who have had wonderful childhoods and wonderful adulthoods, and our parents are awesome and supportive, there's not really a lot of emotion that's attached to, well, of course I'm going to take care of them. They've been so wonderful to me. But not everybody's so lucky to have those kinds of childhoods, or adulthoods, or relationships with their parents. And for us to look at those, and we don't know what's behind closed doors, and we don't know what's in people's hearts, and it's not for any of us to judge when we see people's situations. And look, we're Jews, we judge, we know that, right? But we have to remember that we don't know the whole story. We see one part of one section of one truth of one story. So you may see people in your lives who are not doing what you might do. Well, you don't know what kind of relationship they truly have with their family members. And so looking inward to say, what can I really do, knowing that my parents abused me, no, not me, using general, my parents are awesome, okay, right? But knowing that my parents abused me, or knowing that they neglected me, or knowing that they exploited me in various ways, and now I'm expected to have filial piety towards them and take care of them in their old age? Not gonna happen. So that leads us to, you know, the Ravasi story. Okay, maybe at that point, he's just like, you know what, lady, I'm done. And I'm leaving. Okay. Then we have to find, the filial piety and filial duty does not mean you have to do it. It does not mean that. It means you have to discharge your responsibility in some other way. And it might be that you need to pay a care manager, it might mean you have to pay caregivers, it might mean that you have to pay your siblings to do it. Right? You just have to get someone else to do it, and then you can walk away. Because if you emotionally cannot do the work, you're really not going to be any good to anybody anyway. And some people can work through this. We have caregiver support groups, and I've been running a caregiver support group as long as I've been at JFCS. I love my caregivers. I learn so much from my caregivers. Number one, don't fight with your loved ones about money. It's not worth it, right? Number one, you learn from older people. But the strength they give each other is always very inspiring. But it also is such a judgment-free zone. And so when you have people who are in there saying, I cannot care for my mother anymore, she has been this my whole life, and everyone there's like, and yet you're doing X, Y, and Z, good for you. There are therapists available to help you with that. Because this is emotionally laden times. We can't ignore our own abilities to do what we need to do, our own mental health, our own cognitive dysfunction, right? At a certain point, you wonder, wait, am I just thinking backwards? You have to take care of yourselves because, in the end, truth be told, if you don't take care of it yourself, no one's going to take care of it in that way for you. We talk about that in terms of caregiving, right? You can't pour from an empty pitcher. So you self-care. You have to take care of yourself in order to take care of others. But sometimes you have to take care of yourself because you can't take care of others. And you have to find that balance. So once you figure it out, okay, this is what I can do, now look slightly outwards, right? In terms of everything in social work is circles, right? You have the inner circle, the slightly outer circle, and the bigger circle. Okay. If your inner circle is you, your immediate outer circle is your immediate nuclear family, right? Okay, this is what I can handle. Now let's look, what can I handle with my spouse, with my kids' support? The answer might be nothing, right? If your parents were horrendous in-laws, guess what? Your husband, he's not going to be behind you. he's going to be behind you like this, right? And that's not what you need. But conversations happen. And so you have to see, okay, what can we do as a family? Your gut feeling might be, well, I'm going to totally move my parents in with us, and it's going to be amazing. I'm going to be an intergenerational household. And your spouse is like, I'm going to move into the basement. I'm not going near this. So you can't make decisions in a vacuum. You have to talk to your family members, your immediate family members, about what you all can do. Then you expand it over to your siblings. If you have siblings, not everybody's lucky enough to have them, but you may have cousins, you may have aunts and uncles, you may have your parents' siblings, whatever it might be. Looking to the outside, okay, what can we all do? And is what we want to do feasible? And once you've all figured out what you can do, now you can have the conversation with your loved one about what you will do. Because they'll have their ideas, right? In my family, we've had this discussion, depending on which parent goes first, which child gets the other parent, right? So we joke around about this all the time, and my parent, we'll say this in front of them, and my parents go, what makes you think we want to go with you? Like, you're all making these assumptions. I don't want to live with you. We're like, okay, that's easy. Done. And we have these conversations, and sometimes they're filled with humor, and sometimes they're not. So you always want to look for the natural openings when you're having these conversations. Maybe there was recently a funeral. Maybe you went to a seminar about caring for your loved ones, right? There's always natural openings to go for. But they don't just come on your side. Your parents may be trying to have this conversation with you for a decade, and you're like, oh, Mom, no, you're fine. You're fine. I don't hear anything, and run out the door. But they may have gone to the funeral of a friend and come home and said, oh, my gosh, do we have a They really want to come in, right? You want to make sure, like, how many people in this room, for yourselves, not your parents, not your loved ones, how many people in this room have a power of attorney and a will? Not enough of you. I don't see every hand in the room. And why do I say this? And I say this because we think only older adults need those things, but the truth is we all need those things. If you have minor children, you need a will more than anything else. Because if God forbid something happens to you, the court decides who gets your kids. And if you have family members that you do not want to have your kids, you need a will. Older adults need a power of attorney more, because if you die without a will, if you have immediate relatives, guess what? Pennsylvania, and I'm only talking Pennsylvania, yeah, it's the one I know, there's rules about who gets what, right? It immediately goes to the spouse. If there's spouse, it gets evenly divided between your children. So if you die without a will, it's not as bad. You need a power of attorney for somebody to make decisions for you. And so you think that the document that's more important at the right age is actually flipped. But you all need these things. A living will, halachic living will, that's a little different. Those are not as required, as long as you've had conversations about things. But a power of attorney and a last will and testament are things you all need in your life. If your loved ones, your older loved ones don't have those, get on them first. Get on them first. Because you need to know what they want to do. You need to know. You might be making assumptions. Well, my grandparents, I was a geriatric social worker, I think, for either 8 or 10 years, begging my grandparents to do stuff. And finally, 8 to 10 years after I became, they were in their 80s. They're like, oh, all right, fine, we'll get a last will and testament and a POA. And my grandfather said, okay, I'm going to make all 4 of my children power of attorney. And I said, oh, that's a bad idea. He said, well, why? I said, because if you have Ava and Shia and Jay and Joey, it means no decision can be made unless all 4 are present. He goes, oh, but I want them to talk to each other. I said, Pop, they all talk to each other. I said, nobody wants to make the decision. They all have enough spiel because nobody wants to make a decision on their own about you. They're all gonna talk to each other. And my mother, who was really the primary caregiver, said, I don't want it. So they gave it to my Uncle Shia. Well, my mother actually regretted that because she was the one doing the majority of the stuff anyway. So having the conversations about reality versus I need, I want, these are all conversations to have. But you have to be honest with yourself first before you have these conversations. The need versus want, right? What do they need versus what do they want? They may want to move in with you and have you do everything for them. You may need them not to do that. You know, we talk about this with our children. The kids say, I need candy. Do you need candy or do you want candy? I need to move in with you. Do you need to move in with me or do you want to move in with me? And they may seem, kilometers apart, but in reality it's the same need versus want. Finding out what you need versus want and they need versus want, they may not match, that's a basis of a conversation. That's the basis of communication and having that very open. Where to have these conversations? Not at Pesach Seder. Right? People will often say, well, we're all together, it's Thanksgiving, it's Hanukkah. Don't have it then. Don't have those conversations then. That's not what you're looking for. You want to do it privately. You want to do it knowing that it's the first conversation is not the last conversation. We're Jews, we like to talk. Great, extend it as much as you can. But know that you have to open the door to conversations that are uncomfortable. They may try to shut it. Get your foot in the door, don't let them close it. Every step is a step in a journey. You can't accomplish everything in one fell swoop. You'll be exhausted. I mean, look, we're sitting here for an hour. I really should have had you all get up and stretch before I sat down to talk, right? So if you think about that, and this is emotionally laden, but not that emotionally laden, how much more so when you're having these actual conversations? Some of the topics that you might have to touch on, right? There's housing. Housing is probably the biggest one, right? I want to stay in my house as long as humanly possible. Okay, but Mom, you live on the 3rd floor of a walk-up apartment building in a really bad section of Brooklyn. But I want to stay here. I've been here 50 years. That's great. That's not necessarily feasible. So housing is really one of the most important things. And again, going back to need versus want, they might really want to stay there, but they really can't. The legal stuff we talked about, financial. You should not be paying for your loved one's needs. By which I mean, if you are going to go into debt for your parents, there are services for your parents, and credit card debt ends on death, you're now stuck with the bill if you've paid for things. It is our idea of kibbutz avayim that we have to provide. Providing means finding the resources to help. It does not mean bankrupting yourself. It does not mean leaving your children with more issues because of your parents. That's not kibbutz avayim. Because in the end, when they're gone, you will resent them for the rest of your human life. And that does not bode well for your children learning this. You think you're teaching your kids good lessons, but in the end, what you're teaching them is, oh, look how angry Mom gets when she talks about Grandma. Not what you're looking for. So, taking stock of what's out there. Parents, they're like, but I want to leave an inheritance. Okay, that's great, but that money is for you to use on yourselves. I'd rather have that than have an inheritance that now I have to pay tax on also, and and I still have debt because of what I've put into it. So what we think we have to do is not necessarily what we have to do. Physical abilities of our parents, physical abilities of us, right? Like, my dad has shrunk a little bit over the years, but he's still 5'9", he's a big dude. If I'm trying to help him out of a chair, he's got bad knees, there's a good chance he's gonna fall on me. And he's fine, he can get up on his own, right? But at some point, I may not be that person who can help him. We might need someone else to help him. Knowing your own physical needs is as important as knowing their physical needs. Knowing your emotional needs, the same thing. You are partners in this journey. Right? I said before, you want to make decisions with your loved ones, not for them. That's why you want to have these conversations. Because if you have them with your loved ones, first of all, they can't turn around and say, you made that decision for me. No, I didn't. We discussed this together, remember? But it's also knowing everyone's on the same page. And that's really what you want to look at. So I want to wrap up with, our printer was broken at work. So I have my cards in the other room. We formulated this a long time ago. It's called a personal and financial information form. This is something that's useful for everyone in this room, for yourself, but also for them. Because, and this came out of when I had a client who we became the care manager for her. She was a widow, she had never married, no, she had married, she had never had children. She had a couple of nieces who were as helpful as they could, living 600 and 800 miles away. And we had to help her close out a lot of things. We were helping her move. She had 8 different bank accounts in 8 different banks. And she could not, because she had cognitive impairment, she could not remember which 8. And so we had to, there was a lot of sitting on floors looking at bank statements, let me tell you. Also, I was dragging this poor woman around closing bank accounts and getting checks. I was so worried I was going to be accused of financial exploiting this poor little old lady. But what we learned is you need to know ahead of time where things are, right? If you're applying for certain benefits, if you're applying for veterans benefits for your loved ones, for your father, guess what? You need his military discharge papers. If you're applying for it for your mom, you need your father's military discharge papers. You also need their marriage certificate. These can be copies. They don't have to be originals, but you need to have a physical copy of it. So knowing where things are is very important. So if anybody's interested in getting a copy, I'm happy to email one to you. My card's in the other room and we can get that to you. I would have printed them out, but technology. But really what it comes down to is communication is your best friend. And communication is hard at any age, at any stage. It is the solution to every problem. So what I ask is for you to think about what kind of communication you want to have with your loved ones, but also having with yourself. So thank you all for being here today, and happy to answer any kind of questions. Actually, Miriam, I would ask if you maybe want to stop the recording for the questions, because sometimes people have more private questions.
Thank you.